Hi, and welcome to Terry Talks Movies. This time around, I've got 2 movies from a 3-movie box set because I've already done the 3rd movie on the channel. 1950s, 1960s science fiction, so I'm doing a double feature as I promised you I would. And they're movies I'd never seen before, which is a little bit odd because you get to a certain stage when you think you've seen every one of the 1950s and 1960s science fiction movies from America, and then you find out you haven't. That there's always stuff that creeps into the cracks and you don't quite see it until you're ready to see it. And this one came from Kino Lorber, who produced a triple feature Blu-ray called Sci-Fi Chillers Collection. Now, I'm not fond of the term sci-fi. I think it's a bit déclassé. I usually call it SF or science fiction. Don't like sci-fi, but we'll let that pass. And what Kino Lorber have done is got really good prints of 3 movies from the 50s and 60s. They're kind of obscure, lower tier science fiction movies. The middle one is The Colossus of New York, which I've already talked about on the channel. Stars Ross Martin, Marla Power, terrific sound design on it, creepy as hell, but because I've done it fairly recently on the channel, I'm not going to revisit it. The other 2 are more interesting because I haven't seen them before. The movies you haven't seen are always innately more interesting. And they are from 1957, The Unknown Terror, starring John Howard and Marla Powers again. And from 1966, a weird little low-budget movie which tries to do a creature from the Black Lagoon without the Black Lagoon. And it's called Destination Inner Space, which stars Scott Brady, Cherie North, and Gary Merrill. And that was interesting as well. So what I'm doing is double featuring The Unknown Terror and Destination Inner Space for you right now. So let's get started. The Kino Lorber collection is pretty good. You get a nice slipcover, and inside you get alternative on the back there, and that. Now, the first 2 movies, The Unknown Terror and The Colossus of New York, are on one disc, and Destination Inner Space is on the other, which I don't particularly mind. There are extras for each of these, which is useful. I won't go into the details of the extras. They're not necessary for your enjoyment of the movies, but I will show them to you right now and freeze frame it for a few seconds so you can check them out yourself. We'll do them chronologically, but before I do, I always get weird comments, and I get some pretty kind of disparaging comments on the channel. And I've got to share this one with you because I find it amusing. I got a comment today on the last Science Fiction Saturday video that I did, where a guy said, I got 37 seconds into this BS before giving up. Fair enough, but I'm not sure why you needed to tell me that. So I replied, because I usually reply to comments unless they're really, really, really bad. And I said to this person, you poor brave soul, do you need me to call anyone to help you? Which is the way I react to these kind of comments. I usually find a way to mock them because they're being quite rude. People try really hard to get YouTube videos and they try to give the best they can in those YouTube videos. And then these keyboard warriors who have channels which have no videos and no subscribers, they're not willing to put themselves out there. Frequently, the kind of people who will throw an insult casually and think that they're being so wonderfully edgy when they're really not. Now, I don't mind a bad comment. If I've got some feedback that I need to know in the channel, I'm really happy to take on that feedback, particularly if it's given in a well-meaning way. There are things like the other time when I put a large subscribe button in the corner of the screen to cover up something I didn't want people to focus on. That was a mistake, and I'll wear that, and I won't do that again. But comments like that are never useful at all. They don't help other people discover videos. They don't help other people decide whether they want to see my videos or not. They're just there so that somebody can think they did a sick burn. I can out-insult these people. Every time I can out-insult them. I can be wittier than they are. I can be more salient than they are. It brings out the more sarcastic side of my nature, which is not good for me. It's not an aspect of my personality that I really want to emphasize, but they do it because that's the kind of people they are. Having said that, I'm glad I did a sick burn on this guy. Anyway, let's move on to the first of the 2 movies, The Unknown Terror from 1957. I like a good science fiction jungle adventure as much as anybody else. And this one is kind of good. It worked for me better than I expected it to. It was directed by a guy who has his own place in movie history. A man called Charles Marquis Warren, who made a number of movies, and he's most known for being the one guy who directed an Elvis movie in which Elvis didn't sing. Yeah, Elvis sang the theme song to Charo, but he never sang in the movie. And Charles Marquis Warren is the guy who directed that film. Leaving that aside, this is a studio-bound Hollywood adventure movie. You don't quite know where the locations are. You know there's somewhere on the coast of the Caribbean, but you don't know whether it's a Caribbean island. You don't know whether it's Mexico. And to be really honest with you, for the purpose of the story, it doesn't really matter. In this one, a guy called Jim Wheatley disappears while exploring a legendary cave of the dead somewhere south of the United States, let's say. His sister Gina, played by Marla Powers, who I really like as an actress. She was Roxanne to Jose Ferrer's Cyrano de Bergerac in the definitive version of Cyrano de Bergerac. Gina and her husband decide to go into trouble and try to find where Jim disappeared and to hopefully rescue him, if that's at all possible. They're helped by a guy called Pete Morgan, played by Paul Richards, who is an experienced cave dweller, like a spelunker. And he had an injury, so he's got a wounded leg and he walks with a limp. And so he is reluctantly brought along to help them with this cave exploration that's going to be necessary to find out what happened to Jim. Where they are, they hear a calypso song, which is about the Cave of the Dead, and it's sung by a guy called Sir Lancelot, who was like the king of calypso. He did the calypso song in I Walk with a Zombie, for instance, and he was also in The Ghost Ship and The Curse of the Cat People. So he'd worked with Val Lewton in the previous decade, and he sings this really disturbing little calypso song about how dangerous this cave is and how people shouldn't go there, and that if they do, they're going to be changed by the experience. Really like it. It works for me there. And so they go to this place and they go to the local village. They find a guy who's willing to take them to the village and show them where the cave is. But when they get to the village and he goes out to greet his friends and family, he disappears. And so Dan, Gina and Pete find assistance from an American doctor called Ramsey, played by Gerald Milton, who's really kind of creepy. He says that he has defeated the god of the dead who lives in the caves underneath the village. He has a kind of reluctant wife called Concha, who has an attraction to Pete. So there's a really odd dynamic between these characters. It's got a little bit of the vibe of Charles Lawton in The Island of Lost Souls, that kind of portly, unattractive scientist vibe going about him. And when the three meet him, he's actually canning fruit in jars. He's not doing it for the purpose we think he is. He's doing it actually to facilitate the growth of a fungus. Eventually the group find their way to the cave, and sitting outside the opening to the cave, they hear the moans of the lost souls within. The thing in the cave, it's a fast-growing slime mold or fungus, which cascades through the cave like a kind of thick oozing goo. These are kind of bubble machine to make this oozing goo, which is travelling through the caves and mutating the people who are trapped in the caves and making them all covered in fungus and bestial. And of all of the movie monsters of the 1950s, this is probably one of the quirky ones. A fast-acting, fast-moving slime mold / fungus, which if it touches you, it's going to absorb you or mutate you into a bestial thing. And I kind of like that. There are lots of scenes of this stuff cascading down the walls of the cave, making it a really unusual monster for this kind of a movie. And we have cats fighting somewhere outside. I better go and check that out. Everything's okay. That cat noise is not our cats, so it's all okay. But anyway, yeah, the fungus is a really odd antagonist to the people. This movie has a vibe of its own. The explorers find themselves with two enemies, one of which is a human, Dr. Ramsey, who's kind of encouraging the explosive growth of this fungus, which if it gets out will probably destroy the world. And the other one is the fungus itself, which is fast moving. I mean, it moves at not a snail's pace, but it moves at a fairly good walking pace through the caves and threatens the three explorers who are down in the caves. The weird thing is that at the start of the movie, you think one character is the protagonist, but it turns out it's the secondary character, Pete, played by Paul Richards, who turns out to be the protagonist, We also get that weird dynamic between Pete and the reluctant wife of Dr. Ramsey. So there's all these different currents of character interactions which are just a bit off. And that makes The Unknown Terror really interesting. By the way, that is a pretty bad title. Yeah, it isn't a good hook for this particular movie. But the movie itself really worked for me. It does have a little bit of that I Walk with a Zombie vibe with strange and unknown things and a song written to warn people about the Cave of the Dead. I kind of like that setup. It works and it intrigues us enough to lean in toward the movie. The actors themselves are pretty good. I like Marla Powers as an actor. Paul Richards is really good as Pete. John Howard, the guy playing the ostensible hero, who turns out ultimately to not be the main protagonist, is kind of one of those good-looking actors who had it big in their career in the 30s and 40s, and then in the 50s they were doing movies like this. John Howard's a funny name for Australians because we do have an Australian modern-day actor called John Howard, who's a good character actor. We also had, around the turn of the century, one of our worst prime ministers was called John Howard, so it tweaks different neurons in humans from Australia than it does for other people. But leaving that aside, The Unknown Terror is a good, honest 1950s B-picture science fiction movie, which you should check out. Don't go in with your expectations too high. This is not a Forbidden Planet. This is not a Creature from the Black Lagoon. It's definitely a B-picture, but it's got enough quirky bits to make it more interesting than would be otherwise the case. And I really enjoyed it for that. I didn't know where it was going. I didn't know how ultimately they were going to stop things. And the question remains at the end of the film, have they actually contained this fungus in the cave system? Or is it at some stage in the future going to break free and cover the world in bubbling goo? And so that open ending, while the protagonists do escape, is a little more interesting than would otherwise be the case. It does feel a little bit like the film ended a little bit abruptly where they escaped, but you've still got that lingering tale of, did they actually win or not? And I kind of like that. That stuff really works for me. So that's the first film, and while it's not a banger, it's definitely good value, and it definitely contributes to the enjoyment of this double feature for me. The next came off the rank here is Destination Inner Space from 1966. By the way, Destination Inner Space is a very 1960s title for a movie. And this one has a kind of interesting cast. It stars Scott Brady, who was the brother of Lawrence Tierney, who played Dillinger in a movie back in the day, and who had a really checkered career and ended up, at the end of his career, playing the old geezer at the start of Reservoir Dogs for Quentin Tarantino. So we've got Scott Brady, we've got Gary Merrill, a character actor who never had his intensity at less than 9.5 out of 10. It's nonetheless an interesting character actor who was at one stage married to Betty Davis. And we have Cherie North, a woman who was touted in the 1950s as the new Marilyn Monroe. When the studios were having trouble with Marilyn Monroe, they got Cherie North in to take over a couple of roles that Marilyn Monroe was blacklisted for. And Cherie North was a good actress herself. She had a bit of a career resurgence in the 1970s and turned up in some interesting films. She's in Charlie Varick as the woman who makes the fake documents for Charlie. And she's in a couple of other movies, including Lawman with Burt Lancaster. So I like her as an actress. So you got the three of them there. It's an undersea adventure where a group of people in a sea lab underneath the ocean find an alien spaceship and an alien who comes out of the spaceship and just fortunately happens to be an aquatic creature who attacks the base, attacks the people, and tries to kill them all. That's as far as this movie goes as far as plot's concerned. So the story's basically a guy called Commander Wayne, played by Scott Brady, who's a weird character. The writing in this is cringy at times. He arrives at topside the support vessel for a Civilian Institute of Marine Sciences Sea Lab, a facility on the ocean floor. He rides a diving bell down to the sea lab, and you've got miniatures to play the diving bell and the sea lab on the bottom of the sea. And the miniatures are small enough underwater that you can tell they're small. So that's kind of interesting. They did bother to make physical props to put underneath the ocean so they could film this thing, but the size of the props is pretty obvious when you see them. but you can take that as being part of the charm of the movie. So he meets a bunch of scientists there. There's Cherie North as Dr. Renee Perron, and she's unfortunately one of the two screaming women in this one. She does have a little bit of agency. She gives as good as she gets when this Commander Wayne starts getting sleazy, which he does. He flirts with her in a clumsy and awkward and unprofessional way. But this happened a lot in this kind of B picture. This is supposed to be the hero, but he's the kind of guy you'd report to HR. Then we have a couple of secondary characters. One of the scientists played by Wen Wagner, an actress who was very beautiful but not very good at being an actress. And a guy who had previous history with Commander Wayne, a guy called Hugh Maddox, played by Mike Road. Now, Mike Road, you might not know to look at him, but he did a lot of voice acting in 1960s cartoons. He was the voice of Race Bannon in the Johnny Quest cartoons, and he was the voice of Xandor in the Herculoids. So Mike Road, when he's emoting in this movie, makes me feel like the Herculoids are there or Race Bannon suddenly showed up. But he does a pretty good job of it. But that voice acting voice of his kind of took me out of the movie while giving me a big nostalgia rub on the tummy. And I kind of like that. It's an unfortunate thing for some actors. They've got a distinctive voice that when it's associated with a cartoon character, you can't not feel that cartoon character when they do live action roles, which is a pity, but he does a good job as a character. The other person of note you have on this station, and again, this is a horrible, cringeworthy WTF reported to HR kind of thing. They have a cook in the C Lab, a guy called Hong Lee, played by James Hong. And he gets some of the worst Asian stereotype acting dialogue ever in this movie. It's a disservice to him as an actor. It's a disservice to that part of the planet. But it's cringy as hell. But it happened so very much in 1960s cinema and television. You got the cook in the Bonanza, for instance, and all those kind of characters. Just cliched Chinese characters. And yeah, James Hong had to, of course, put a roof over his head and food in his mouth. And so he took these roles. But geez, I wish they had given him some humanity. And that part of it takes me out of the movie. But that's not to say the movie's without virtue. It's beautifully shot. It's in colour. There's a lot of underwater sequences which are done pretty well. There's a bit of turbidity in the water, so you get some scenes that aren't as crisp looking as they might be. But there are some good aspects to this. The monster suit is pretty good, and it's got a big hunchback so you can hide the actor's aqualung underneath that, and that works well. It's a well-designed suit. I mean, it's effective, but it doesn't look anywhere near as good as Mildred Patrick's design work for the creature from the Black Lagoon, because that's the goat of this kind of aquatic monster design. But it still works. It's creepy enough for this kind of a movie. Even though I wanted to really like this film, and I definitely lean towards it, there's the sexism and the racism and the awkward dialogue made me not love it as much as I would otherwise. And that annoyed me because I went into this movie with goodwill towards it, and the movie disappointed me from that point of view. I mean, I like the fact that they were ambitious with the special effects. They made these large-scale models to put under the water to be the underwater sea lab and things like that. They did all the underwater photography. They had got in some interesting character actors to fill out the roles. And then when it came to the script, they totally pissed away the goodwill. Disappointing. Even though, of course, it was 1966 and they did things differently then. I would have liked it more if the professionals had acted professional. And you've got to remember too, and people forget this, at least people who haven't worked hospitality, cooks are professionals. And having a cook who's a professional, whether he is a person from China who has limited English or not, treat him with respect in your narratives, treat him with respect in your movies. It's a bloody hard job working in the kitchen. I did it myself for 8 months. It messes your social life. You learn some mad skills really fast, of course. But that Hong Lee character was a clanger that I'm finding it hard to forgive. I'm all on board with 1950s, 1960s science fiction having slight cliches as far as characters are concerned. but having the severely insulting ones pissed me off a lot. But again, it's one of those movies that tried hard with a limited budget. The sets are fairly small because obviously they didn't have much room to build big sets. And there are a couple of interesting things where they set up a whole bunch of tripwires and spear guns, because spear guns is what they have on the underwater sea lab, so that when the monster comes into the lab in a certain area, they can shoot it with the spear guns. Doesn't necessarily work on this, but there is some thought, and they did what they could with the resources they had as far as the physical area, the mise en scène of having this underwater lab, where you've only got 3 or 4 different sets you can build, one of which is a set with a pool in the bottom of it so people can come into the sea lab after scuba diving. Didn't quite land for me, which is a pity, because I wanted it to. And I wanted it to be better than it is. And again, it comes down to the thing I've discussed on the channel before of having that goodwill for a film and wanting it to be better than it is. And that's the headspace I've been in for a while with a few movies lately, where I go in open-hearted and want it to be okay and want it to be good. And like a bad first date, it disappoints. That's what I'm living with at the moment. And of course, I suppose at some stage we all do if we're watching movies. We hear good things about it, we watch it and then go, what the hell was that? That's the kind of headspace I got with Destination Into Space. So there's the 2 movies for this time around. One better than the other, even though it is in some ways a much more primitive product. It went in with the intention to tell a story. And even though the foaming, bubbling fungus may look funny to some people, it kind of worked for me. The mystery of what was going on intrigued me enough that I kept on with the movie. But Destination Into Space would have liked a better actor as far as Scott Brady is concerned, but it is what it is, and I had to call it that way. So thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please like, subscribe, hit the notification bell. Let me know what you thought of these 2 movies, if you've seen them or not, or whether you're going to fork out for the Sci-Fi Chillers collection. I think it's worth getting, particularly with Colossus of New York and The Unknown Terror. I think you'll get your money's worth with that one, and you can take or leave Destination Into Space as you choose to do. You can also support the channel by donating to the channel, becoming a channel member, or else by becoming a patron at patreon.com/cherrytalksmovies. If you do any of those things, you get early access to my travel vlogs where I drive around and do a bit of a stream of consciousness chat. It'll turn up for people who contribute to the channel a couple of weeks before it shows up on the main channel as an extra video. Next up, I've got all the imprint new releases that I received this week. And they're all 1960s bangers. Groovy movies from the 1960s. Some obscure, some not obscure. But they're a lot of fun. So until all of that stuff happens, watch some good movies, watch some bad movies. Give this one a go. It's 2/3 good. And I'll catch you next time.